You need to be motivated because of what you're doing and not the idea it's soon going to be over. Now, if you're cycling around planet Earth and you're going 1,000 miles every 4 days, when you're in the middle of the Gobi Desert or North Dakota, you're not thinking about Paris and the finishing line, which is thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles away. You've got to somehow ride that emotional roller coaster, the highs and lows of every day. It's that never-endingness of it, and the inability to focus on the end is the switch. And so being physically strong gets you so far, but the X factor when it comes to ultra endurance is a resilience to injury, and it's about managing the psychological roller coaster. And it's not saying that you're a super positive, motivated, happy person. It's having a performance mindset. And the way I always think about it is, when you're down, knowing that it'll get better. And when it's going well, knowing that it'll also dip off. And not sort of accepting any state as a steady state. So when you're...
Mark, how are you doing?
Doing great. You're just down the road from me. Shame we couldn't actually meet up.
I was considering it, but it's sometimes more hassle than it's worth, and your video quality is excellent, which is hardly surprising. So we'll crack on as we are. But growing up in Scotland, do you want to just talk us through your sporting background? Because Scotland has an awful lot on offer, and I often find it's difficult to choose what direction to go in. So why don't you just run us through what growing up in Scotland was like for you?
Growing up for me was rural Perthshire. So for those that are not familiar with Scotland, sort of bang in the middle, foothills of the Highlands. And I'm often asked these days, did you ever consider becoming a professional? Right now as we record this, the Commonwealth Games are going on. We've just finished one of the most exciting Tour de France's in recent history. So people often ask me, did you ever consider becoming a pro tour cyclist or an Olympian? And I'm flattered by the compliment. I genuinely am. But I never had that crossroads in my life. I never had the thought or the opportunity or the coaching at an early age to go into professional sport in that sense. I was always destined to be an adventurer. I was always destined to be an ultra endurance athlete because I didn't go to school till I was 12. I grew up on a small farm with my two sisters. The reality for myself and my two sisters were that we had a farm to run, and we maybe did an hour or two around the kitchen table doing the subjects. But a lot of primary school is babysitting. It's not really being a student. And so for me, it was every morning getting out. We had 60 goats to milk. We had 13, 14 horses to muck out and put out. We had, we had a farm to run. And so, between, building dry stone dikes and, joinery, building hen houses and, just general farm labouring, I was very sort of physically able in the way that a lot of kids, I guess, aren't. A lot of kids have to go to scouts or whatever else to learn that great outdoors, and it's something that's fitted into their schedule. Whereas when you have this sort of swallows and Amazons existence growing up on the farm, you're massively physically able. So with that kind of upbringing, my reality was riding ponies, then horses. That was my main sport really till I was about 15, and skiing. I was a season ticket holder at Glen Shee, which was just up the road until I was 16, 17. You wouldn't bother doing that anymore, sadly, with the snow cover we've got. Climbing hills, camping out, it was all adventure stuff. It was all out there solo. So when I was thrown into high school for the very first time, aged 12 going on 13, I really struggled with the playground. So all the stuff that you're meant to be good at, like playing football, playing rugby, all the rest of it. I'm a big guy, 6'3". I'm now 90 kilos. Like, I should have been good at those sports, but I'd never played a team sport. And if you're learning at the age of 12, 13, you've missed all those formative years. So if you talk to my peers from school, they would say I was terrible at sport. I was really sort of back of the class in terms of sport at school, because everything that they defined as sport, I was terrible at. Whereas I was hugely physical, and I just wanted to climb mountains, go skiing, ride horses, and ride my bike. So I was always destined to do more sort of solo adventure sports. And that journey started pretty early, with cycling across Scotland when I was 12, Land's End John O'Groats when I was 15. It grew pretty organically. And of course, then in my 20s and 30s, I was a professional adventurer. I was doing expeditions, on a global stage to 130 countries, filming for the BBC and others. And then you sort of have people saying to you, wow, did you ever consider doing the Tour de France? And it's interesting because those worlds never crossed. Like I was never coached. I was never trained in that sense. I was just this wild man from a very early age who loved adventure.
you almost have the archetypal portrayal of what growing up in rural Scotland is in American movies. This logs over your shoulder, really rough and tumble sort of existence, and it's obviously paid dividends in the long run. But what was it that drew you to bikes of all things? Because obviously that physical upbringing, there's nothing obvious in a farm environment that drives you there. Was it just something you had lying around? Was it something that just instinctively you felt was right for you, or was it wanting to avoid the playground, wanting to avoid team sports, and finding that individuality and that time alone that you could get away from it all?
I think as kids, when we all need sort of pillars of our identity, things that, matter to us and we can associate ourselves with. And they can be positive things or negative things. Ill health can be a pillar of your identity. It doesn't have to be a sport. But my point is, I was already very sort of physically able. I was already sort of enjoying, for me, the fact that, the horse or the bike were very practical. I wasn't doing it to train. I was doing it to go on journeys. I was doing it because I wanted to, go places. And so sport for me was never really about, beating anyone else. It was very much about, your connection to wild places, going on journeys, pushing myself. And I think then the reaction when I went to high school, and especially for the first 2-3 years, really not fitting in that sense, really struggling, I think that probably reaffirmed the fact that I had to do something outside of school to sort of counteract the bullying and the misfit nature of being this homeschooled, socially inept kid. I mean, I can laugh about it now, but turning up and being thrown into that playground with 1,300 kids, dressed by mum. I'd been in overalls and Wellington boots for the first 12 years of my life, and I was clueless. I mean, I was easy picking. So the fact that I already enjoyed these things, and it gave me something outside of school to focus on. And actually, when I started to do interesting stuff like cycle across Scotland, for the first time get a glimmer of respect from, my peer group. I look at my daughters now, aged 9 and 6, and they're just such social chameleons. They can be thrown into any situation, and they have the ability to stand their own ground, and they learn those things at such an early age. When you learn those things as a teenager, you're always an outsider. You're always observing, and you're always trying to figure out situations. So I've become in adult life very, very good at assimilating and throwing myself into any situation. It's whether it's a stag do or a keynote speech to 10,000 people. I can assimilate any situation, but it's a very learned behavior. When you don't socialize for the first 12 years of your life, except for with the goats and the horses, it's a very strange thing to then end up in that environment. So to go back to your question, cycling for me, and why cycling? I think cycling gave me a freedom. I always say I don't meditate, but I ride a bike. It's time in my own head. It's time where I can push myself. It's time where I can be competitive, but with myself. And I think that's been there, since I was very young.
When was the seed planted for your first trip around the world? And important distinction as well on the defining terms around circumnavigation versus a trip around the world, because there are nuances, aren't there, that are important to consider when it comes to the formality of executing it to the level that you did.
Yeah, so I mean, and around the world could be any route around the world. I mean, take when Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman went around the world with Long Way Round. They never went to the Southern Hemisphere, so that's not a circumnavigation. So an around the world could be you dancing around the flag at the North Pole, to take it to its extreme. Whereas the circumnavigation is a very set thing. Whether you're sailing it or cycling it or running it, believe it or not, people have run it. You have to go a certain distance. You have to hit 2 antipodal points, 2 points on the opposite side of the planet. You're not allowed to go back on yourself. So, for me, I've gone around the planet twice. I've always gone west-east. And there's a bunch of other rules. So a circumnavigation is a set thing, whereas an around the world is I'm going around the world, and you can go up, down, left, right, any distance you want, as long as you kind of get back to where you started. So when I think the important thing to say is I didn't have any grand plan. There was no career plan. There was no 5-year plan when I graduated from Glasgow University, with an economics and politics degree. I didn't sit there and go, I'm going to plough my own furrow and I'm going to be a professional adventurer. At that time, I had a decade of amateur expeditions under my belt. I'd, crisscrossed Europe, and I'd been a ski instructor out in Italy, done a lot of time in the mountains. I had this great passion for adventure. But I thought I was going to work in finance. I thought I was going to take my economics degree and, like everyone else in my class, I guess, at university, go and get a graduate placement job, do my CA and work in the city. My want to take a bike ride around the world was simply the thought that if I've only got one chance, why don't I go as big as I could dream? This is not going to be a stepping stone to anything. This is a post-university, let's get it out of my system, and then I can go and do my graduate placement job, whatever that might be. So I thought, well, if I've only got one chance, let's cycle around the world. And I assumed that the circumnavigation world record by bicycle would be the most professional and the most coveted record in the book. I thought it would be the ultimate. When I was a teenager, I was inspired when Ellen MacArthur broke the sailing record, single-handedly. I mean, that was I love those stories that become bigger than the sport that they exist in. So if you think of the Alex Honnells of this world, or the, Ellen MacArthur's, you don't need to be into sailing or climbing to be inspired by these incredible leaps in performance and what these athletes have managed to do. So I assumed that cycling would be in a similar league. And so when I started to research as a fourth year student at Glasgow Uni what the record was, I was amazed to find that the record stood at 276 days to get around planet Earth. It's an 18,000 mile route, so 27,000 kilometers. And, even though the longest ride I'd done at that point was about 3,000 miles, I looked at that and I thought, why is that not being done properly? Why is it so slow? I mean, I know it's slightly unkind to everyone who's ever gone for the record before, but that's very slow, very slow. I mean, to give some context to this for listeners who are new to the idea of cycling around planet Earth, the record to get around the planet now is 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. So we're talking nearly 200 days quicker than when I first spotted it. So I wasn't sitting there as a 22-year-old kid going, I am the best qualified, strongest bike rider on the planet, the most qualified person to go for this ultimate of ultra endurance records. It was more of a feat of enterprise. It was more a case of, why has nobody done this properly? This is insane. Like, I could pick up a Guinness World Record here without even, having a coach or having trained before. Like, it was more a case of, what an opportunity. I mean, you couldn't do that now. Now, don't get me wrong. I did have experience, but it was still a massive step up to go, I'm going to graduate and go on an 18,000 mile race around the planet on my own, unsupported. I mean, I look back now and I was wonderfully wide-eyed and naive. But, it was there for the taking. And my simple plan was to ride 100 miles a day, a century a day. And, you could do that. Lots of people could ride 100 miles a day. But it was still a massive step up to do that every single day for half a year. There was a big unknown to that, and not just the physicality, but going through, Iran, sleeping in mosques, going through India, go through monsoon season in Southeast Asia, across the Australian outback. There's lots to think about there, which is not just about, can I physically do this? The expeditionary element of it. But when I did it and came home and had managed to make a film for BBC Scotland, it suddenly went from being this sort of slightly mad, let's get it out my system, post-university adventure to, hang on a second, I've built a platform here, and I've got, whilst it had been really hard to get that first dream off the ground, I then had, lots of inbound inquiries and book deals and talk tours and the BBC saying, where are you going next? We'll back you. And, at that point, as a 23, 24-year-old, you're not going to go back and do your accountancy qualifications. You're off on an adventure. And I feel like I've been on that adventure ever since. I'm nearly 40 now.
Which is a fantastic thing, and something I think a lot of people are more aware of when thinking and reflecting on their own lives now post-pandemic, is how can I find that for myself. But what really fascinates me, and this is a question I get asked a lot, because ultra endurance is generally an older person's game. The average age of Ironman athletes is coming down, but it started from a very high point. The average age of ultra endurance, ultra marathons is higher than you'd expect. At the age that you were, where do you think that psychological confidence and power over the fear that would afflict most people really came from? Was it your upbringing? Was it the naivety? Or was it just the sheer opportunity of there is a gap in the market for me to capitalize on here?
I think you've got to have it's a fine balance, isn't it? When people come to me every single week with their big ideas, their big expedition plans, I'm sure you're the same. You get a huge amount of people going, this is my dream. How am I going to do it? You can't do that for them. They've got to figure it out themselves. I mean, I help people as much as I can, but the thing that I always say to people is shoot for the stars, but learn your trade. And I think that second bit is missed often. You know, if you want to climb Everest, row the Atlantic, cycle around the world, I'm never going to say don't do it. But I also know that 1 in 10 will actually get to the start line. You need to be better at not just not just the sport, but everything else. You know, athletes have a massive familiarity bias, which means all we want to do is physically train and be physically able for the task. But if you're going to build a business, and if you're going to build a lifestyle around major races or major projects, you need to be thinking about and good at so much else: logistics, finance, communication, the team around you, and more. So for an athlete to be able to have that awareness of what else it takes to be successful and to plan that like you would any other business. I say for some athletes, they just want to hit the gym, get strong, talk about their FTP, and, that's enough. Well, guess what? I'm still not the world's best bike rider. I'm not the best bike rider in Edinburgh, but the reason I've had the ability over the last 20 years to consistently break world records and create these leaps in performance is because I've got a great team around me, and because I've got a really good awareness of what else it takes other than physical training to be able to take on these things. And I think that sort of holistic approach to it is pretty important. But to go back to the first project, yeah, there was wonderful naivety. And you look, and if anyone ever picks up The Man Who Cycled the World, which was my first book, or what goes back and watches it on YouTube, the adventure is really everything that happened off the bike. Where are you going to sleep each night? Where's your next meal? How are you going to get through? It's the story of the kindness of strangers, the people, the places, the landscapes. Just that having, had an education here in Scotland, and then for the first time going out there and experiencing the world firsthand on your own at the speed of a bicycle. I mean, it's magical. So, yeah, of course there was that sort of massive leap into the unknown. But with 20 years experience now and what other people say to me every week about their dreams, it's the gumption to actually make it happen. Create the time in your life where it's not just an idea, but a reality. To back yourself when other people won't. To find good people around you who believe in you. And to put timelines around these things so they actually get done. And I think the credibility part, as I say, is taking the skill set, which might be your physical competence or whatever else it is, and actually applying it to something truly difficult. And, a lot of people in life will only take on things which they know they can do. And it's sort of a self-protection. It's we want to know we can do it before we do it because we don't want to fail. But if you're in the game of creating leaps in performance, if you're trying to do world first and world fastest, then you've got to get comfortable with a space where you've got the component skill set, you know what it takes, and it's certainly not pie in the sky what you're trying to do. But when it comes to the actual endeavor, you're making history. You're going into the unknown. You're doing something which has not been done before. You're writing a script which nobody else has done before. And people, for whatever reasons, will tell you it's impossible, mainly because they look at the status quo and say, well, there's no reference point for what you're trying to say. And if I could replay the hundreds, if not thousands of conversations I've had over the last 20 years, not just with people I don't know, like would-be sponsors and media, but my close friends and family, the people who actually care about me the most. But because they care about me, they're worried that, they don't want me to fail, and they want me to play it safe, and they want me to... And so even doubt even creeps in from, your parents, your partner, your best friends. And it's having an ecosystem around you and a belief system where you can take all that in, but you can stand on your own 2 feet and you can say, this is what I believe is possible and how I'm going to do it on what timeline. And I think that's the hardest bit, because people always get hung up on what their skill sets are, their physical competence or whatever else. But, if I go back to that first cycle around the world, it was having the gumption to back myself and just get out there and do it. And I mean, there's quite a few times in my life where I've had an idea, I've rationalized why it's possible, and then I've just gone for it. And then you quite often then need to sort of slightly build the plane as you fly it and build a great team around you to make that possible. But if all you're ever doing is sort of looking over your shoulder and saying, well, what did I do last year? Let's beat that. Or what does competition like? Let's beat them. Then that's comparative success. That's just incremental gains. If you're really wanting to shift the dial, if you're really wanting to do something more interesting than that, then you need to have the quiet confidence. And it is a quiet confidence. This is not arrogance. You need to have the quiet confidence to go, right, what's the skill set that I've got? Who else have I got around me? Right, how can we do things differently? How can we fundamentally do things differently? And I've got that sort of childlike glee. I love getting into that space where I'm like, okay, I'm into the unknown. And I can't find a better way to describe that, but it's a lonely place, but it's a thrilling place as well. And I'm not really talking about physical endeavor here. I'm talking about that risk profile to try and do things that have not been done before.
It's one of the rare opportunities you get in this rather chaotic world that we live to very much steer the ship, isn't it? Because you're into the unknown, the blueprint is yours to create, and it gives you that creative freedom, which I sometimes refer to it as almost my artistic expression, purely because if you asked me to draw a tree, it'd probably look like a cat. But I know what you mean. Obviously not to the scale that you've achieved it on, but that lonely place and the thinking that goes in it, and the building the plane as you fly it is something that's very rewarding once the wings are on. And what you've just said there doesn't apply just to ultra endurance. It applies to absolutely every walk of life. Building a business, having an awkward conversation about a relationship, whatever it can be. I think the biggest thing is getting some skin in the game and just going for it, which sounds cliche, doesn't it? But far too often we spend too much time planning, scribbling, plotting, and talking to people before actually learn as you go, and you'll build something along the way that is much closer to the end goal than had you not started in the first place.
Yeah, and I do understand why people try and de-risk their goals in life, whether it's building a business or taking on an expedition. They do try and de-risk it by understanding everything before they start. And I guess my challenge these days is everyone tries to build a brand and become very professional before they've actually done anything. And I'm a bit old-fashioned, I guess, about this, and I think you've got to get out there, learn your ropes. That bit about learn your trade, do stuff, just do stuff, put yourself into difficult places and do stuff, and then more organically build an identity, a brand, an ecosystem around what you're doing. Because you can spend all day long fine-tuning a plan, figuring out how you're going to communicate that, coming up with some sleek presentations, but ultimately if you've not got the story to back that up. I feel lucky that my first expeditions happened before social media. So when I first went around the world, or then I backed that up with a 9-month expedition down the length of the Americas, I was filming, and it's not that long ago, but I was filming on mini DV. So I was shooting on BBC cameras that were reel-to-reel cassettes, and then couriering them back from Pakistan or Chile or wherever I was. And I got to live these expeditions for myself and then for an audience that would see it afterwards. So I felt like I was taking a UK and then global audience with me, but my focus was very much in what I was doing, and I was in the moment. And then it was only sort of 3-4 years into my career that social media really started to take off. And I then had to start to tell what I was doing in real time, as opposed to, package it up for, say, a books or documentaries or talks afterwards. And it completely changes the lens of how you're taking on that journey if you're constantly having to sort of communicate it as you go. And it's not a bad thing. But I often say to athletes when they're taking on their first expeditions or races, try for the first few times to just live it and understand it and be in your own head. Capture it if you want for an audience afterwards, but don't tell the whole thing on Instagram stories as you go, because you won't learn nearly as much about your own psychology, your interaction with the world around you. You can then build that on top afterwards, but I plead people to try and go out and do it for yourself, learn your skills, build your learn that trade bit, and then sort of layer the real-time bit over the top, because otherwise you end up in this very false world, especially if you're trying to do this professionally, where you're sort of living your life through this sort of avatar that you've created for yourself, but you're not actually investing the time in doing very difficult things and learning how you operate in that space. So everything is very much for the shop window, as opposed to actually having a great shop. And it changes your decision making in terms of what you're going to do. You know, you end up sort of just curating projects which are very sort of visual and immediate. But you know, a lot of my early expeditions, I was away for 3, 6, 9 months at a time. And, you know, I was very much sort of investing time in myself as an athlete and figuring out how I could operate in these very remote, difficult, often dangerous environments. And then clearly I built a broadcasting career alongside that. But, you know, I guess for me it was luck that, you know, my career started before social media. I didn't have to build that communications platform in the same way that people do now. And the risk is, as I say, that you're very, very front facing from the start. You're very polished. You've got a wonderful brand, but you lack the credibility. You lack the credibility because you've not done the stuff and lived it and owned it and sort of earned your stripes. And it goes back to that very first point that I made, you know, shoot for the stars, but learn your trade. And it's very hard to learn your trade if you're doing that, you know, publicly all the time. You got to put the hours in. Got to put the graft in, and it's not all for Instagram.
The man in the arena is all I could think about there, and the sort of age-old considerations there. The psychological thing is the big thing there, because my social media journey, for want of a better phrase, began as a way of documenting my journey to charitable endeavours, which meant that sometimes the best thing I could do was showcase and tell people what I was doing, but other times I just had to get my head down and crack on with the brutal training session that was to come. And I remember probably the biggest turning point in this career journey, ultra experience that I've had, was when I first saw 10 p.m. start from Glasgow back to Edinburgh on foot. And I just thought, oh Christ! Self-supported, nobody to call. 10 p.m. I was expected to get back in about between 8 and 10, and just all the mistakes in the world, all the things I got wrong. I was filming it as I went to do stuff with afterwards, but actually that became because it wasn't in real time, it became like a diary for me, just reflecting on my own thoughts. So getting to watch that back and understand the thought processes that I had then and how I'd frame them now from a personal point of view quantifies exactly what you've just said there, because it allows me to understand the psychology of actually having gone through the process and what comes out the other side. Makes it easier for me to dress up the storefront because I'm more in tune and more self-aware, so I know how to put things across. And I know exactly what you mean when it comes to if you want to keep presenting this persona, but the persona isn't being reinforced in the background, before you know it, you're going to be detached in what you're presenting versus what you're actually living. And that's a risky place to live in psychologically, I think, because you could lead yourself into a bit of an identity crisis, or a bit of a
for sure,
a confused state of mind in terms of what direction you should be going, or if you're doing enough, or if you should be doing things differently, and it can become quite self-critical, I'd imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I guess not that many people listening to this will be trying to build a career as, you know, professional adventurers, so, you know, maybe it doesn't apply. But I think it's more a case of understanding that you need to get good at more than just the bit that you enjoy doing. And for athletes, I'd say that's physically training. And the psychological resilience. I've just finished writing a book about sports psychology, and I wrote a book previously called Endurance, which was sort of touching on all the important aspects which allows athletes of all ilk, but especially bike riders, to go further. And the way I framed that up is young, old, male, female, we can all do endurance. You know, not everyone can be a sprint athlete. Not everyone, you know, can be a power athlete, although you might argue against that point. But my point is that everyone has the ability to go further. Everyone has the ability to push themselves at a pace. And it's wonderful to see in ultra swimming and ultra running and ultra everything that all ages, from 20s to 80s, from, you know, and people of all backgrounds and and the equality, especially, you know, in terms of, I mean, I've absolutely loved watching like the Golden Trails running series, and you know, some of the ultra records that have fallen, and the women that are absolutely leading the way there. I mean, this is why endurance and ultra endurance is such an exciting space, because physically there's no reason that people can't do endurance, whereas in other aspects of sports there can sometimes be limiting factors. But then the most interesting, what I find when you looked at nutrition and fit and training, and the most interesting chapter within the endurance book was psychology and the headspace bit. And so that's, I sort of took that chapter and made a wider book about it with a friend of mine over in California, Dr. Jim Taylor, who is a psychologist, having worked with, you know, US ski team and triathlon and some of these top athletes. But it's the one bit which, even though I've just written a book about it, you can't really learn in a book. It can sort of signpost you to, you know, you can give somebody a training plan in terms of what to do physically on the rack or on the turbo, and I can signpost people in terms of, you know, the mental toolkit to be able to endure. But it's only going to make sense when you put yourself in difficult places. You know, it's not going to make sense.
Lived experience is the only way to get there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Gaz Banford, who's been on this podcast before, ex-sergeant major of the SBS, the simplicity of the way that he puts it when people ask him, "Oh, how can you teach me how to live like a special forces operator?" And he says, "Being experienced is experiences times 1,000."
Yeah,
that's it. It's just you've got to get in the ring and sort of fight your way through these things, and you'll come out the other side resilient. So, on the psychology side of things, you were away for 194 days in 2008, were you, give or take?
Yeah, first time round, yeah.
And that's an awfully long period of time to be away on your bike, traversing the world. And whilst, yes, there's immense beauty, there's immense loneliness, there's amazing people you meet, there's a real eclectic mix, there's a roller coaster, there's a lot of things going on. Who were you when you returned, psychologically? What was your sense of self? What were the lessons that you learned? And where did you feel you fit within the world at that point? Because I can imagine the emotional come down must have been fairly severe.
Yes, and it always is. I think in my early 20s, when I was doing some of those early expeditions, I was on my own. You know, I didn't have a partner or wife or kids or the things I do now. So, I always found when you're on expeditions, you've always got the road in front of you, quite simply. You've always got that sense of momentum. You know, the only thing worse than going slowly is stopping. And even when it's difficult, you know, you're just trying to figure out. And life is wonderfully simple, you know. It's physically hard, but it's about getting by. It's about carrying on in that journey. It's very linear. So when you're out there, you've always got something to focus on. When you come back and you've had that sort of the blinkers on and that record in mind, you know, I'd say for 6-9 months, whatever it is, there's a real, even though you're super busy when you come back, thrown into the media and, you know, the events and everything that happens afterwards, life's quite confusing and not particularly satisfying because it doesn't have that sort of simplicity and hardship that you've got used to on expeditions. So there's always a big blue patch, and you always feel slightly silly because you think you should be living on cloud nine, and you know, I've smashed a world record, I've done what I set out to do, I should be eternally grateful for that opportunity. But it's trying to sort of recenter yourself and have a sense of purpose, and what are you focused on except for running around and spinning far too many plates and just being silly busy. And that's a very different reality to the simplicity and the hardship of expedition. So I think I've got better at that over the years, because the thing you need to do is you need to switch what your focus is. Now I've got 2 beautiful daughters, I've got Nikki, my wife, I've got other things going on in my life. So when I come back, you know, I'm very much grounded and refocused in other realities. Because when you're on expedition, you're allowed to be wonderfully selfish. It's about you and it's about the physical task. But when you're a dad and when you're a husband and when you've got other business interests, you know, you can't just sort of wallow in your own sort of self-pity of not being out there, you know, traversing a desert anymore. You've just got to get on with it. There was a wonderful moment when I came back from cycling around the world the second time. I'd broken the world record again, and, you know, it'd been a super intense project for 2.5 years, and then I'd been out racing there for 2.5 months. There was a wonderful moment where, you know, I'd been living in the media for a couple of weeks. It'd all been a bit crazy, but I was struggling with that sort of readjusting back. And I was reading Harriet, my eldest daughter, a bedtime story and tucking her into bed. And I said to her, Harriet, is it good to have Daddy home? And she said, yes, Daddy, but you keep saying that. And it was a wonderful moment where it was just like it took a child, it took my daughter to sort of say to me, get over it, Daddy. You might have just cycled around the world and broken a world record, but I don't give a shit. Like, just be here, be present, be in the moment and be Dad. Like, it doesn't like, I love that, because you've got to just change your focus, change your perspective, change your reference point to the world. And that's quite hard to do when you've been blinkers on racing for months on end. But that's what you need to do. You need to switch. You need to get over yourself. You need to find a new focus, and you need to sort of center yourself differently. But it's always disconcerting in business as well. When people sell their business, or when people get to their summer holidays, or when people reach those milestones that they've been looking forward to, they very rarely do backflips and feel euphoric and all the stuff that they think they will. You feel relief, heartfelt relief. And then you feel slightly lost and confused. It's the same when people retire, because purpose gives us that sense of like, I've got something to focus on and my reality matters. Whereas when you stop, that all goes away. And, in terms of our own mental health, that's a really good thing to know about before you get there. So you can sort of, you can reach out to those that matter to you. You can create connections which, stop you sort of dropping into too much of a slump. But it's worth calling out, because I think the reality of achieving anything big and meaningful in your life is always a little bit different than what you imagine. And other people perceive it differently as well. And then you feel silly for not being as excited or as ecstatic as they expect you to be.
We can scale it down as well, because I recently we spoke about this in the last podcast recording with somebody, actually, was the come down effect of whatever process driven goal you have achieved, whether it's your first 50k, your first 100k, your first Ironman, or selling your business for 50 million quid. Whatever it has been, there's been an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of ups and downs to get there, and your life has become a certain pattern. So when that pattern is gone and you're in this limbo zone, you're recovering, your Achilles is sore, you're shopping for supercars, whatever it might be, within these examples, I think the best thing to do is preempt it by having something there ready and waiting to stick your teeth into. And for you, that is now your family, your other business interests, which probably makes it easier than when you were coming back from these expeditions with a bit more fluidity and less responsibility, because you had to go and find something. But having it there as a constant means that you've got to switch lanes, like you said, and you can't just sit there and not be present and think about the desert in Iran or whatever it might be. So from an ego point of view, how did it feel in 2010 when Vin Cox broke the record? Did you feel hurt? Did you feel damaged? Or were you just proud that somebody else had shared the same journey that you had?
I'll be honest, my eye wasn't really on the ball. I mean, people always assume that I sort of owned that and, protected that and, it's mine, and I went back and broke it again 10 years later. I'll be honest with you, quite a number of people broke the record in the 10 years in between, and I watched it from afar, but I had no emotional connection or ownership around that record, because I just don't think I was ever the kid that was trying to beat anyone else. So when I set out to cycle around the world in 195 days, and I did it in 194 days and 17 hours, I did that and I moved on, and I was very proud of that. But then when somebody broke the record a few years later, and of course they could, I mean, crikey, I certainly wasn't the world's best bike rider, and once I put it on the map as a big BBC documentary, there was no shortage of people that said, well, of course you could go quicker than that. It was a relatively soft record to break. I had no emotional connection to it at all. I was pleased for Vin, but I didn't really relate his success to my record. I wasn't happy or sad about it. I didn't really feel like I owned it. I did what I did. It was out there. He broke it, great, and I genuinely had no emotions, personal emotions, in terms of what that meant for me, because I'd never really sort of thought, well, that's my identity, and I need to somehow sort of regain that space. I don't know if that makes sense, but quite a lot of people over the decade in between the two times I cycled around the world referenced my record, because I'd done it in a very public way. It was a 4-part BBC One documentary series. And I think one of the aspects was they felt like by doing that, you know, the biggest bike ride out there, it's the planet, it's the world, that it should give them the legacy, the business opportunities that it had clearly given me. I mean, I was young, I was 22, 23, and I clearly launched my career off the back of that. So the feedback I got from not so much Vin, but from Julian Serra and others that went for it, and then there was a whole race, a whole group of people went for it, including Sean Conway and Mike Hall and others, that this would be the launch pad for so much more afterwards. And I think people were quite disappointed that it often wasn't that. You know, you would go faster, you would do an amazing physical task, and then it would be today's newspaper, and then, you know, people were back to whatever they were doing before. And they were slightly
first mover, though. I think you if you create the platform, that's everything else that followed came from that first mover effect. So anything else was actually subsidiary to what you created in the first place, is the way that I view that.
Well, I think there is that. I think the first time you do it with a big platform, but also realizing, and it goes back to, I guess, what we were chatting about 15, 20 minutes ago, the actual task of being a bike rider and breaking that record is completely separate to telling that story in a way which gives you opportunities afterwards. So the broadcasting career that I launched at the same time, and how I went around packaging that, if you like, was very purposeful. It had a lot of intent behind it. It wasn't just an accident where, you know, I raced fast and then there happened to be a 4-part documentary series and a book deal and a talk tour and the rest of it, which then opened the door to lots of other things. That was, you know, that was very planned. That was very intentional. So if you want to just go out there and have a wonderful adventure for yourself, you know, you can do that. But if you want to build a business out of it, well, that's a completely different skill set. And so I think quite a lot of people were surprised that they went quicker, broke the record, but it didn't unlock those opportunities. So when Vin and James and Mike and other people went on to break the record, I was already off sort of building my career in a very sort of I would say planned manner, but some of the best things that have happened in my career over the last 20 years, I didn't originate. You know, I've been out there creating opportunities myself, but then some of the best stuff, by building a profile, by having a skill set, then that I've been open to ideas coming my way. And I don't want to come across as entirely selfish, but I was very much sort of building my team and building my ambition and and I wasn't looking over my shoulder and trying to protect where I'd come from. I wasn't sort of saying, that's mine, back off. You know, it was great to see, you know, so many people going for that ultimate record, the circumnavigation. And I always said that I would never go back and try it again. It was only really in 2016, 2017, after breaking the Africa world record, that I realized that as an athlete, I'd learned so much since those early days. I'd progressed so much. By my mid-30s, I was a much, much better athlete in every sense of the word than I was when I was a graduate age 22. And so what I wanted at that point in my career was to have one opportunity in my life to put all my cards on the table and say, what is my ultimate? You know, this was not about really the experience of the people and the places and the geography. I just wanted one opportunity to go absolutely nuts and say, what is my Everest? And if I was going to do that, I wanted to do it back on the world stage, back on the circumnavigation, you know. So again, not being unkind to anyone else out there, but I wasn't trying to beat anyone. When I took the record, you know, back in 2017, I wasn't trying to break anyone's record. I was trying to figure out my personal best, and I felt like there was another massive leap in performance in terms of what I knew to be able to do that. So
it's interesting, again, to come back from learning your trade, as you said before. You wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years previously.
But I also think it's interesting because I am in the public eye now, and people do see me as a bike rider with all these. When people, you know, even at events, come alongside me or see me on Zwift, they always try and go, "Come on, Mark, I'll race you." And I'm still that kid. I'm still that kid in the playground for the first time who really struggles with adversarial competition. When somebody says, "I'll race you," I instinctively back away. I'm not trying to beat anyone. I'm not trying to race anyone. I'm trying to figure out my personal best. I love pushing myself, but I've never managed to outgrow that kid in the playground that doesn't like direct competition, which is bizarre when you build an entire career on world records.
I completely empathise with that, because from a YouTube comment point of view, the amount of times I've had, oh, my mate did this and he did it in this time and he works a regular job. There's a perception that I just train full time as well on the internet, which makes it even harder to communicate. But whenever somebody says that, I can't compute that mentality. Whenever somebody baits me on Zwift or whatever it is, I just don't, my brain doesn't work in the same way. I don't react to it. Like, yeah, let's go. It's no, I'm doing my thing, you do yours. And I think that's ultimately what gives you, I think it comes from, it's a trained thing that comes from ultra endurance, but it's also something that lends itself well to actually being able to stay in the fight as it goes on. Because the less ego, the further you'll go, I think, to a point. And 2017 key difference was it was supported this time, wasn't it? So for you, this was everything on the table. What is the most athletic, highest performance output we can generate here to cover this in the shortest amount of time? And 78 days? Do you still hold the record?
Yeah, I still got the record. So 78 days, 14 hours, 40 minutes. So averaging 240 miles a day for 2.5 months.
Oh dear.
So the simple
you have
sum,
so little respect for your backside. It's unnerving.
So I mean, if listeners are not bike riders, imagine getting out your scratcher at 3:30 every morning, on the bike at 4. You ride 4 times 4 hour sets. And you got to average 25k an hour, which is not super fast, but you got to do it for 16 hours every day. You're in bed by 10:30. You get 5 hours sleep. The alarm goes off at 3:30 and repeat. And you got to do that every single day for the next 2.5 months. And what I find interesting is I've taken a lot of phenomenal athletes into the ultra endurance space, rowing the Atlantic or high altitude mountaineering or some cycle trips. A lot of trained athletes, they can put themselves through hell. They can do really, really hard things because, for the glory of it, we like pitching ourselves against the difficult. We like, physically testing ourselves. But so often athletes are motivated by the idea that it's soon going to be over. So, it's that sprint mentality. Now, up to and including Ironman, because it still is over in a day. So you can put yourself through hell. But that night you can have a beer, a warm bath, and the reflective glory. It's that type 2 fun mentality. It's hell at the time, but it becomes incredibly important in terms of your identity and who you are. Now, it gets a bit different when you're on multi-week, multi-month expeditions. And I've seen that quite a lot of times when I take these sort of physical specimens, these phenomenal athletes into the ultra-endurance space. And in the simplest possible way, you need to be motivated because of what you're doing and not the idea it's soon going to be over. Now, if you're cycling around planet Earth and you're going 1,000 miles every 4 days, when you're in the middle of the Gobi Desert or the Australian outback or, North Dakota, you're not thinking about Paris and the finishing line, which is thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles away. You've got to somehow ride that emotional roller coaster, the highs and lows of every day, the sleep deprivation, how you're buggering your circadian rhythm, getting yourself through 8 to 10,000 calories a day consistently, day in, day out for months. And it's that never endingness of it and the inability to focus on the end that really is the switch. And so being physically strong gets you so far. But the X factor when it comes to ultra endurance is a resilience to injury. I often think that my ability to not break down, it's not because I've got a phenomenal FTP. It's not because I'm got a great VO2 max. It's not because I'm the fastest. It's because physically I can keep going and I'm very resilient to injury, and that's all about training. And it's about managing the psychological roller coaster. And it's not saying that you're a super positive, motivated, happy person. I mean, that whole positive mindset thing is a bunch of nonsense. It's having a performance mindset, knowing what you think and do matters, and also accepting that it is a massive, massive roller coaster. And the way I always think about it is, when you're down, knowing that it'll get better, and when it's going well, knowing that it'll also dip off, and not sort of accepting any state as a steady state. So when you're inexperienced in ultra endurance, you sort of think that when you start to fatigue or you start to feel worse, then the only way is down, because by keeping doing what you're doing, you're going to continue to deplete and get into a worse and worse place. But actually, with experience, you realize that the body and the mind has an extraordinary ability to rebound. And you can keep doing what you're doing. You know, you can tweak your fueling, you can tweak your thinking, you can input differently, and the body can come back while still doing what you're doing. Whereas if all you've ever done is, say, run a marathon, you assume that it's like a battle of attrition where the graph goes down and down and down physically and mentally until you completely run out of steam. When you do these things for days and weeks and months, you realize that the mind and the body has the ability, and you've got to let it go through these incredible peaks and troughs, but knowing that the only thing that you can rely on is change. The only thing that will change is the fact that, you know, you will perceive pain differently. You know, even if you're in a lot of pain, doesn't mean you're always going to be in pain, because your relationship with that, you know, will go through cycles. And it's a superpower. It's knowing that, you know, there's no steady state, and that you can do a lot more than what you perceive in any given moment, and trusting the process. You know, not getting ahead of yourself. Just ride the road in front of you. Stay ruthlessly consistent with your inputs. You know, your sleep patterns, your hydration, your nutrition, and trusting that the outcome will take care of itself. Because most people don't fail at major expeditions or races because they can't do it physically. It's because, you know, when you mentally give up, you physically give up. And it's that the sheer scale of what lies ahead that normally freaks people out.
Speaking of that, Race Across America was your most recent endeavour, and yeah. I was following the prep very closely because I was just fascinated by the detail and the aero position and just the sheer strategy behind it, because it's fast. It's an entire country that we all deem as massive, but you were aiming to cross it in under 6 days and 7 hours, I think, wasn't it? Give or take. That was the plan.
Yeah, we wanted to go sub 6. The record was 6 days 10 hours, but we wanted to go sub 6.
And prep seemed to all go swimmingly, and you've obviously got just a litany, cascade of experience to this point that can prepare you for how to take on something like that. There was a big coaching team, but things didn't go to plan, did they? You had to call it short. Do you want to just talk us through the reality around what actually happened, but then more importantly, how you as an individual felt in that situation? Because you've so often managed to find a way through within the parameters that you've set.
Yeah.
So it must have been a bit of a challenge in some ways.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a huge project. You know, I'd love to take on some of the world's hardest ultra endurance races, things like Race Across America, Cape Epic. You know, there's others. I've always been an expedition guy rather than a race guy, but there is a bucket list out there of these iconic events which I've long wanted to do, and RAM is at the top. So I was in the pairs category. We were going to relay hour on, hour off for 6 days across America. We'd done a 1,000-mile training ride where we were on pace for it, so we knew it was possible. And then 14 hours before the race started in Oceanside, California, John, my race partner, tested positive for COVID. And it was pretty desperate insofar as you've got no time to react. I mean, I thought of three things. A, I could try and sub somebody in. I was phoning with my buddies back in the UK to see who could get out to San Diego fast to sub in. We wondered if John could, you know, if he tested negative, could get back into the race if I just started, or if I could race solo. So I set out on my own, even though all the teams around me were leaving, you know, with pairs or fours or eights. And I just tried to buy us time. So I was making the best of a bad situation. So it was really bizarre to race out on my own. I cleared 450 miles in that first 24 hours. I just sort of got my head down and raced hard, barely got off the bike, cleared California into Arizona. But in that 24 hours, you know, it became clear with my amazing support team, you know, there's 18 crew working for us, that we didn't have any of those options. Once the race started, you couldn't substitute a teammate in. Even if John tested negative, he would have to wait for 5 clear days before he was allowed to race. And all the solo athletes had left 5 days previously, so having left with the teams, I couldn't now compete as a solo athlete. So when I started the race, I was still clutching at straws, still hoping for a plan B. In the middle of Arizona, when the reality of not having any options, we couldn't complete, and the year of prep, that's when I cried. That's when I got upset. That's when I was absolutely gutted. And I'm not going to pretend there was any heroics at that point. I was absolutely gutted. It was a huge financial commitment. It was time away from my family training. It was, a lot of time and effort. I'm a better athlete in many senses of the word than I was even when I cycled around the world. I've trained incredibly hard over the last year with my coach, Prav Bryan, with my whole logistics team, performance team, to be able to step up once again. So I was very proud of, that commitment, that consistency, and from the team behind me. So to not be able to complete on the race. But you know what? Sometimes you can't control everything. And there's certain things we can learn and I would do differently. But I'll be honest, it was a process. It took me 2-3 weeks I was pretty quiet on social media. I just came back and spent time with my family. And I've now started to refocus on how to use that fitness and that form, to the positive. But, I'm not going to pretend it was a bunch of roses and it was all fine and don't worry. I was gutted. Because the commitment to take on that race was not just mine, but it was my family's. It's evenings away from them. It's one day every weekend, not playing with my kids, out there pushing myself hard. And the sacrifice is theirs, not mine. I enjoy racing my bike, but when you've got family behind you, they've got to buy into these dreams. So when it doesn't work out and there's not that prize to share, you feel guilty and you go through all the spectrum of sort of human emotions. So I'm not going to wrap it up as something it wasn't. Sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's okay. That's part of the game. But I'm not going to pretend it's fun.
No, I can't imagine it was. Just the reason I asked is knowing that it was something that was out with your control, and stepping into a team environment within a race is a very different challenge to take on. I'm sure it hasn't put you off too much in terms of longer term ambitions. It's just another bump in the road, or a brief moment of impact in your backside, as you're probably so used to from gravel at this point. But I was watching it unfold and thought it's one of these things that's just so uncontrollable. But the emotion that goes with it must have been so intense.
But don't you find, Fergus, that the emotions often take time to catch up? Like in the moment, in the fight or flight, when things go wrong, you just try and find a solution. You try and be proactive. You try and be positive, and then it's often like a week later, when the dust is settled, that's when you have a cry about it, and you really, all the irrational thoughts and the upset happens, and you at that point you have to be very, very careful in terms of that whole sort of accountability ladder, to not just start slinging shit and blaming others and being wallowing in the self-pity of having failed. It's so important to sort of live those emotions and sort of accept that it's incredibly upsetting, but to internalize it, rationalize it. It's hopeless when people say to you, don't worry, be positive, get on with it, it's fine. And like all the things that you should do in the moment are very hard to do when you're sort of processing. But I think it's just having that filter between the internal and the external, because when you're working with professional teams like that, you've got to thank people, you've got to respect people, you've got to realize the sacrifices that they've made. So when you're sort of wallowing in your own self-pity, you've got to have that filter between the internal dialogue and the close team around you, and the fact that for my family and for my team supporting me, they are also sort of trying to sort of unwind from that. So I think that's an important sort of footnote to when things don't go well, because it's so easy just to blame others, get upset, and then sort of create this sort of narrative in your own head which allows you to move on. And you've got to be honest. And the whole how can you learn from it and what would you do differently? Don't force that. That takes time. Don't try and do it when you're upset.
And ultimately, you don't get the opportunity to do things differently unless you do it again. And ultimately, the emotions you're feeling and the intensity of those emotions come from the fact that you were the man in the arena that experienced them. And for those that haven't, they can't relate. But that in itself is a learning opportunity. It's a growth opportunity, and that in and of itself is a success in my mind. So it's reframing things in that way. It
is. But I think in this day and age, people put massive pressure on themselves to be a better person every single day. And I think that built an unnecessary expectation on life. So when you do difficult things and they go wrong, I said this to Hank, my teammate on GCN, when we failed at another thing last year when we were trying to break the Land's End John O'Groats tandem record. when his knees blew up 500 miles in, when we couldn't complete the task, there was that immediate pressure. What should you learn? What should you do differently? How can you be a better person tomorrow? And I said to him, be kind to yourself. I said, sometimes in life, it's just a story for the grandkids. It's a story that you can put on the shelf, and it's something you once did, and you didn't learn anything from it. And it served no purpose at all, but it was just a difficult, daft, crazy thing you did, and it's a story for the grandkids. And I say that as an important note because this incessant need to sort of self-improve and be better creates a horrible pressure with people. And sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. And sometimes it's just a story for the grandkids. And I think having that caveat is not weakness. It's just being kind enough to yourself to realise that, when you do difficult things, they're not always going to work out.
I'm picturing you sitting in the corner of a pub somewhere, telling a stranger at the bar, "Did I ever tell you about the time that I did this?" And it looks quite fitting. But with all the suffering that you've gone through, are there any fundamental, universal lessons that you think can apply to anybody that's looking to make progress in their day-to-day life, athletically, business-wise, or as a family member, as a father, as a husband, as a mother, whatever it may be? Are there any universal lessons that your perspective on the world, having rode around it twice, have given you?
Okay, I'll pick on two. We often don't do things in life because of a fear of the unknown, and we listen to the news and we divide the world into how different people are and cultures are, and we pit ourselves against whether that's different countries, different cultures, different clans and creeds. People are always about, this is who I am and that's who they are. I've had the opportunity over the last 18, 19 years to film and be an athlete in 130 countries. Like I said at the start, the more you travel, the more you realize that how similar people are in terms of their motivations, their values, their want to, do things which are worthwhile and purposeful. So I guess my point is you building a level of trust, being open to people, listening, having an empathy to people. I think, if you listen to the news too much and you don't travel yourself, we naturally build walls and our world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I guess my first point is make your own mind up. Don't just believe other people in terms of how you should judge people or places. Some of the most memorable, most wonderful places I've been to are the ones that are most different from what I expected, like Iran and Sudan. I'm not going to move my family to them tomorrow, but they are markedly different from what you hear in the press in terms of the people. And there's more that connects us than separates us. And I think that gives you a completely different perspective of anything you want to do in life if you start from a position of, compassion and commonality as opposed to, what makes you different. So I guess that's sort of a big picture point, which is quite useful. I don't care whether you're cycling around the world or building a business. And the second one, which I think is quite helpful, is I've always been seen as a solo athlete. And so people think this is purely about sort of my gumption to get out there and do this and stubbornness and all the rest of it. If you're going to do difficult things in life, and again, it doesn't need to be as an athlete, you have to build what I would call a wise counsel. You have to have people who you trust, who are not emotionally connected to what you're doing. So people often think, oh, my wife or my partner is my soulmate, and therefore they're the person that supports me best. My caveat to that is your soulmate in life or your best friends are often emotionally, financially, in every sense connected to your success. So whilst they do love you and support you, their support for you is massively biased by the outcomes that serves their purposes as well. And this is a very honest point. Sometimes in life, your partner is not the right person to be the wise counsel. You need to have people outside of the people who directly rely on your success and your career to have those really objective, practical conversations in life in terms of what am I doing. So if I think back over the last 20 years to really crossroad moments, things that have taken my career in a totally different directions. Yes, I talked to my mum. Yes, I talked to Nikki. But I also have 3 or 4 people who I really trust, who have led very different lives to me, who are brilliant at having conversations over a pint, over a coffee, over lunch, that I can say, this is where I am, here are my choices, and just talking through what I'm going to do. And I think having a few people in your life who you can have those conversations with, who aren't emotionally or financially connected to the outcomes, allows you to not be completely alone in those very difficult moments. So you don't need to go out, you don't need to go out and sort of find them today, but just think about who you have in your ecosystem that you trust, you like, you connect to. And it's not a formal role, but I sort of see it as my life's non-execs, the people who I sort of trust and can turn to, because I don't do these things on my own. And I'm also very aware of what I can put on my wife, what I can put on my mum, what I can put on my sisters in terms of their emotional support for what I do. Because when I'm doing really difficult things, it's sometimes unfair to ask them what they think. Because, if I'm saying to my wife, can I go away on this big trip or take this on this project? She's not lived, her skill set is completely different to mine, and it's an unfair question to ask. And when I'm doing truly difficult things, which are quite entrepreneurial, I need to be able to think them out loud. I need to be able to share them with somebody who doesn't have that emotional connection to the outcome. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I would just encourage people to think, look, you can't do these things on your own. You if you're going to really be in the driving seat for your own career, think about who you trust and like and can catch up with every couple of months, so you can think out loud.
It's almost a constant calibration point. So try and find those people. I know who they are in my day-to-day life, and it's been very, very useful for me to have my own board of non-execs in my personal life. It's a very useful thing to happen. But Mark, thank you very, very much. Where is the best place for people to find you for your books, podcasts you've done previously, or anything that you have coming up next?
I'm pretty easy to find online, at Mr. Mark Beaumont on all the main platforms. Links to the podcast series, which I had, the endurance series, is also on the website, markbeaumontonline.com. And yeah, there's 20 years of stuff out there, books, podcasts, documentaries, the life that I now lead, trying to invest in high impact Scottish innovation. We're trying to back a whole ecosystem of businesses that are addressing global issues around climate change, clean technology, agriculture, aquaculture. I'm very passionate about trying to make a difference, not just in sport, but also I think Scotland's got a really important place to play in the world in terms of creative solutions, innovation that can have a positive impact. So I spend an equal amount of my time training as I do trying to find entrepreneurs and founders who are scaling high impact companies. So anyway, whatever your interest is, whether it's riding a bicycle or Scottish innovation or other, there's loads of stuff online. Just Google me.
Everybody in the southeast has just switched off at this point now. Scottish innovation, none of that, none of that. But no, thank you very much, Mark. Really enjoyed that, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Superb.